The day my son-in-law handed me divorce papers for my daughter was the same day I found out he'd been sleeping with his paralegal for 8 months. He didn't tell me that part. I had to hear it from my neighbor Gord's wife, who heard it from someone at her book club, which is how things travel in a town like Kenora, Ontario. You sneeze at the Tim Hortons on Main Street, and by supper half the lake knows about it. My name doesn't matter much to this story. What matters is that I'm 61 years old. I spent 34 years building a small commercial property management company from nothing, and I watched my daughter Celia marry a man named Preston Holt when she was 28 years old, and I thought he was decent enough. Firm handshake, remembered my coffee order, came to every Christmas. I figured that was sufficient evidence of character. I was wrong about that. Celia called me on a Tuesday in late October. She didn't cry right away. That's the thing about my daughter. She inherited her mother's way of going very quiet when something is breaking her. She told me Preston had served her papers that morning. She was sitting in the parking lot of the Shoppers Drug Mart on Lakeview Drive because she couldn't drive yet and she didn't want to cry in front of anyone at work. I drove over and sat with her in the car for 2 hours. She talked. I listened. I didn't say what I wanted to say about Preston, because I'd learned from 30 years of marriage that when your child is in pain, the job is to be still and present, not to perform outrage on their behalf. I saved that for later. I did a lot of saving for later. What Celia told me that afternoon, piece by piece between silences, was this. Preston had met the paralegal. Her name was Vanessa Croft. She was 33. She worked at the family law firm where Preston was a junior partner. About a year ago at a firm retreat up near Muskoka, he'd been careful. He used a second phone Celia didn't know about. He deleted emails. He paid for hotel stays with a credit card on a business account. He was, it turned out, quite organized about it. The kind of person who plans things. The kind of person who tells himself that makes it acceptable. The thing about Preston that had always made me faintly uneasy, though I could never name it until that afternoon in the Shoppers parking lot, was that he was genuinely skilled at making people feel they owed him something. He'd helped me with a lease dispute a few years back, reviewed the contract, gave me advice, wouldn't take money for it. At the time, I thought he was generous. I understand now that he was building credit, storing it somewhere, so that when he eventually needed to draw on goodwill, he had some to spend. He'd started drawing on it with me about 6 months before the divorce papers, though I didn't know it then. Little things. He'd ask my opinion on property matters, defer to my judgment in a way that felt flattering. He called me twice to just check in, which he'd never done before. He came to my granddaughter Lily's school concert and sat beside me in the auditorium and made a point of leaning over to say she had Celia's gift for focus. I thought he was being a good father. I understand now he was managing me. The divorce papers were clean, he told Celia. He wasn't asking for anything dramatic. He'd already spoken to a mediator. He was being reasonable. He kept using that word, reasonable, as if the goal of a marriage ending ought to be reasonableness, as if being orderly about cruelty made the cruelty less real. What he was asking for in the settlement was 50% of the equity on the house they'd bought together in Kenora 4 years ago, which was fair enough on paper. He was also asking that Celia not pursue spousal support, which her lawyer told her she could legitimately claim, given that she'd reduced her hours at work when Lily was born and had not fully returned to full-time since. And he was asking for shared custody of Lily on a schedule he'd already drafted, which had her spending 3 weeks of every month with him and 1 with Celia, his own daughter, 1 week a month. I'm not a man who loses his temper easily. I grew up watching my father lose his, and I made a decision early that I wouldn't carry that particular inheritance forward. But sitting in that parking lot, hearing my daughter explain Preston's schedule for his own child in a voice that was so carefully neutral it frightened me. I felt something go very cold and very clear inside my chest. Not anger exactly. Something more like arithmetic, like I was starting to count things up. I asked Celia one question before I drove her home. I asked her whether Preston knew about my business, about the full scope of it. She looked at me a little confused and said he knew the general shape of things, that I managed commercial properties, that it had done well enough over the years. She didn't think he knew more than that. I hadn't talked about the specifics with anyone outside my accountant and my lawyer since Margaret, my wife, died 4 years ago. It wasn't secrecy. It was just grief making me quieter about the things that had been ours together. I nodded and said okay. I told her I loved her. I told her to call her lawyer first thing tomorrow and to write down every conversation she could remember having with Preston about finances, about Lily, about anything that might matter later. She said she would. Then I drove home, and I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold while I thought. Let me tell you about the business, because it matters to what came next. When I was 26, Margaret and I bought a small strip mall on the edge of Kenora with money borrowed from her parents and a bank that I had to visit 3 times before they said yes. It had a laundromat, a hair salon, a locksmith, and 2 empty units we filled within a year. I managed everything myself for the first 4 years. Fixed plumbing on weekends. Negotiated leases on my lunch break from my actual job, which was systems administration for a regional credit union. Over 30 years, we grew it. Not fast. Not dramatically. We bought when other people were scared and held when other people were selling. We picked up a small industrial property in Dryden in 1999 when the price was unfashionable. We bought a mixed-use building in Thunder Bay in 2007, just before the market moved, and spent 18 months renovating it slowly and doing most of the coordination ourselves to keep costs down. Margaret did the books for 15 years. She had a gift for seeing which numbers were telling the truth and which ones were being polite about bad news. By the time she died, the company held 14 commercial properties across northern Ontario, and its annual net operating income was, by any reasonable standard, significant. Not Bay Street money, not the kind of wealth that makes the news, but the kind that, compounded quietly over 3 decades, becomes something that would surprise most people who knew me as the man in the Ford F-150 who showed up to fix the eave screws himself rather than pay someone else to do it. I had restructured the company the year before Margaret died, on the advice of my accountant, who told me I needed to protect the assets for estate purposes. So the properties sat inside a numbered holding company, which was wholly owned by a family trust. The trust had 2 beneficiaries, Celia and me. The numbered company had a name in the registry, but it wasn't my name or Celia's. It was a string of numbers and letters that wouldn't mean anything to anyone who hadn't been told what to look for. Preston had never been told what to look for. I don't say this with pride, exactly. I say it as a fact that became relevant in October of that year, when my daughter's husband, who had been building his own case quietly for months, speaking to mediators and lawyers and financial advisors, while appearing to simply be a reasonable man, discovered that the asset base he thought he understood was considerably more complicated than he'd assumed. The first sign that things were moving in a direction Preston hadn't planned for came about 3 weeks after Celia's call. He reached out to me directly. That was unusual. He texted, then called when I didn't respond to the text. He said he wanted to talk, man to man. He said he thought we could get through this without it becoming adversarial. He said he still respected me. I told him I'd be glad to talk. I suggested the coffee shop near my office on Tuesday morning. He said that worked. I want to be clear about something before I describe that meeting. I didn't go there to perform anything. I didn't go there with a plan to reveal or confront or humiliate. I went because I genuinely wanted to hear what he had to say, and because I'd learned that the most useful thing you can do in a difficult situation is let the other person show you exactly who they are without interrupting them. Preston was already there when I arrived. He'd gotten himself a large dark roast, and he stood up to shake my hand, which I thought was interesting. The formality of it, in a Tim Hortons in Kenora, with a man who'd carved his own turkey at my table for 9 Christmases. He talked for about 12 minutes without me saying much. He explained that the divorce had been hard for him too. He acknowledged that the timing was painful. He said he hoped Celia would eventually understand that staying would have been worse for everyone, including Lily. He was very fluent. He'd clearly said versions of this to several people already. Then he got to the point. He said he'd been doing some thinking about the family finances. He said he knew I'd help Celia and him with the down payment on the house. He said he knew I was comfortable His word. Comfortable. He said he wasn't asking for anything that wasn't fair, but that it seemed to him that the settlement conversation ought to include a full picture of what Celia might have access to going forward, given my situation, and that this affected how spousal support should be calculated. He had a folder with him. He put it on the table between us. Inside was a printed summary of what he believed my assets to be: the house I live in, 2 properties he knew about, because I'd mentioned them at dinner years ago, my RRSP statements from 2019 when I'd asked his opinion on an investment, and a rough estimate of business value that was, I will say, charmingly underinformed. It was based on the 2 properties he knew about. It valued the business at approximately a quarter of what it was actually worth. He slid the folder across the table and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as professional sympathy. He said he just wanted everything out in the open. He said transparency was important to him. I looked at the folder. I looked at him. I picked up my coffee and took a drink and set it down. I said, "Preston, I appreciate you sharing this." He nodded, clearly relieved that I wasn't upset. I said, "I'll have my lawyer send yours the full picture." He nodded again. He thought he'd won something. I could see it in the way his shoulders settled. My lawyer's name is Walter Perkins, and he has handled my affairs for 22 years. He is not flashy. He wears the same 2 blazers in rotation, drives a 9-year-old Subaru, and has the disposition of a man who has heard every variety of human foolishness and finds all of it equally unsurprising. When I called him the morning after that coffee meeting and described what Preston had presented, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Well, let's send him something thorough." The disclosure package that went to Preston's lawyer 6 days later was 37 pages. It included a full accounting of the family trust structure, the numbered holding company, all 14 commercial properties with current appraised values, the annual NOI statements for the past 5 years, the trust deed naming Celia as a 50% beneficiary, and a legal opinion from a trust and estate specialist in Toronto, confirming that none of these assets were matrimonial property under Ontario family law because they predated the marriage, were held in trust rather than in Celia's name, and had never been used as matrimonial assets. In other words, Preston could not touch them. They were not in play. They had never been in play. What was also in the package, and this was Walter's idea, not mine, was a parallel document outlining Celia's legitimate claims, her reduced income during Lily's early years, the career advancement she'd delayed, the spousal support she was entitled to under the Spousal Support Advisory Guidelines, the custody arrangement a family court judge would be likely to favor, given Lily's school enrollment, her primary care history, and the settled community she'd built in Kenora. Preston's lawyer called Walter 2 days later. I know this because Walter called me that evening and said, in his unhurried way, they'd like to discuss a revised approach to the settlement. I said that sounded fine. I asked Walter if Preston had seemed surprised by the disclosure. Walter said, his lawyer used the phrase significant revision to our understanding of the asset landscape, which I took to mean yes. I laughed. It was the first time I'd laughed properly in 3 weeks. What happened over the next 6 weeks was not dramatic in the way that revenge stories usually are. There was no confrontation in a boardroom. No moment where Preston stood in a hallway and had his illusions stripped away while an audience watched. It was quieter than that, which I think is actually more satisfying, though it takes longer to appreciate. Preston's settlement proposal, the one he'd presented as reasonable, was revised 3 times. Each revision moved closer to what Celia's lawyer had been saying was fair from the beginning. By the 3rd revision, the custody schedule had changed from 3 weeks with Preston to near equal time with a primary residence at Celia's, which is what the school and Lily's routine required. The spousal support was included. The house equity was split, but the calculation accounted properly for the mortgage payments Celia had made from her income during the marriage. The paralegal, Vanessa, left the firm about 2 months after the divorce proceedings began. I heard she'd moved to Sudbury. I don't know more than that, and I didn't look for more. She's not the one who made the promises to my daughter. Preston is still practicing law in Kenora. I see him occasionally. We are civil. I think he is a man who convinced himself over many years that being competent at the performance of decency was the same as being decent. And I think that error is its own punishment in ways that are slow but accumulating. I don't wish him catastrophe. I just stopped holding him any goodwill in reserve. There is one more thing, and I tell it not because it is the most important part, but because it is the part that Celia keeps returning to. About 4 months after the divorce was finalized, I was meeting with my property manager, a woman named Irene Shaughnessy, who handles the day-to-day operations at our Thunder Bay building. We were doing a walkthrough of 2 units that were coming up for renewal. One of the current tenants, a small bookkeeping firm that had been in the building for 6 years, had a new junior partner who came to the meeting to discuss lease terms going forward. His name was Derek Holt, Preston's younger brother. I didn't know Preston had a brother in Thunder Bay. He'd never mentioned it to me in 9 years. Derek didn't know who I was at first either. I was introduced by Irene as the building owner. It took him about 45 seconds, watching my face as Irene said my name, to put it together. His expression when he understood was something I'll remember, not embarrassment exactly. Something more careful than that. He shook my hand and he said, "Mr. Calloway, I want to say, I know what Preston did. I'm sorry. What he did was wrong. I wasn't expecting that." I thanked him. We sat down and talked about the lease renewal like adults. He got reasonable terms because his firm paid on time and kept the unit in good condition, which is all I actually care about in a tenant. When Irene and I were walking back to the car afterward, she said to me, "Was that awkward?" I thought about it for a moment. I said, "No, actually, and it wasn't." That's the part I keep coming back to. None of it, in the end, was about drama or confrontation or making someone feel small. It was just about knowing what was true, having the records in order, letting the numbers say what they said. Margaret used to say, and she said it about the business, about tenants who tried to negotiate in bad faith, about anyone who confused the performance of power with the real thing. She used to say, "Let it run its course. The ones who know what they're doing don't need to announce it." I think about that a lot now, not just about Preston and what he tried to do, about Celia, who is doing better than I expected, and probably better than she'll admit, about Lily, who spent last Sunday afternoon helping me rake the leaves in the backyard and told me she wants to learn how to fix Evastrews, which I took as one of the best things anyone has said to me in years. About this life that Margaret and I built together, property by property, lease by lease, in a part of the country that most people pass through on their way to somewhere else, not realizing that this is somewhere, that people build real things here, that the quiet work of decades amounts to something that doesn't need to explain itself. The folder Preston slid across the table at Tim Hortons was wrong about almost everything. But he wasn't wrong about one thing. Everything was out in the open now. It just turned out the open was considerably larger than he'd thought.